Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 136, a publisher spotlight on Conundrum Press.
Countdown for blast off. X-5, 4, 3, 2, X-1, fire.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this week's episode, we're going to do a publisher spotlight. This is something that we do occasionally, and I really enjoy doing these, Andy, looking at the seasonal output of one particular publisher, focusing only on them. And this time around, it's going to be Conundrum Press. So there's a lot of good stuff coming out this spring from Conundrum that you and I are going to discuss. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of that show, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. All of the other publishers, you'll find that their discounts are at 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible, mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price. Sometimes it's at 50% off cover price, but often those discounts are more impressive than that.
And the mind-blowing just keeps on coming. There are so many great bundles at DCB Service. I'm just going to tell you about a couple of them real quick. Getting ready for the summertime, we've got a couple of bundles that you just can't ignore. There's the Vertigo bundle, there's a Valiant bundle, and this is the incredible one, the Marvel Secret Wars bundle. You can get all of the Marvel Secret Wars issues for 50% off.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, unfortunately, we won't be talking about the Secret Wars on the Comics Alternative, given our nature, but that doesn't mean you, dear listener, can't take part of the specials that our sponsor has to offer. Discount Comic Book Service, they're great. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right. And Derek, you know, we're also sponsored by Audible.com, who has more than 180,000 audiobooks and spoken word audio products. They're the leading audiobook publishers, and you can choose such comic-related titles as Sean Howe's Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, Harry Broad's Superman is Jewish, Douglas Wolk's Comic-Con Strikes Again, and Lawrence Mawson and Michael Cantor's Superheroes, Capes, Cowls, and the Creation of Comic Book Culture.
Get a free audiobook of your choice at www.audibletrial.com/comicsalternative. That's audibletrial.com/comicsalternative, and get started today. So, Andy, how have things been going for you, my friend?
Things have been going really good. A busy week, a lot of reading, and a lot of good reading from Conundrum Press, which I'm very eager to discuss.
Yeah, I am too. But before we get into that, we should let everyone know that we have another new podcast patron, and this is Christopher Michael. He became a patron last week. And this comes a week after Paul Lay became a podcast patron on Patreon. So these guys joined the noble ranks of other patrons such as Salgood Sam, Michael Nohale, Tom Matthews, Don Witzel, Simon Brilsby, David Campbell, and Rainer Koschnick. So, Christopher, welcome to the gang.
That's right, Christopher. Welcome aboard, and thank you for supporting us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, we like it when we get new patrons on Patreon. And you guys who are patrons, go ahead and share the news, share the love with your friends and family. Maybe you can get them to be podcast patrons as well.
Yeah.
You know, on the topic of Patreon, if our listeners want to go to our Patreon page, that's www.patreon.com/comicsalternative. You'll see that we have a new video up for the Patreon campaign, and the audio is a lot like the original one that we had up there, but I changed the visuals around a bit. So that's what I was doing most of the afternoon on Saturday, Andy, and I felt like, as arduous as it was, I'm glad I got it done. It's not the most professionally produced video out there, but hey, it has that DIY feeling, that comics alternative feel that just seems a little up close and personal.
There you go. That's what we're all about.
That's right. And, you know, on the topic of video, in addition to that new Patreon campaign video that I just mentioned, I've also decided to do something with the Comics Alternative that I've been contemplating for a while. We have set up a channel on YouTube. Now, technically we've had a YouTube channel for a number of months right now, but we haven't really used it at all except for maybe having our Patreon video, our original one, up there. But what I decided to do over the past few days is to put our episodes up on YouTube. So if you want to find out about our YouTube channel, it's www.youtube.com/user/comicsalternative, or you can just do a search on YouTube for Comics Alternative and you'll find our chapters. Now, the visuals on that are basically simple. It's just one image, and it is that episode's cover image. So it has one of our Comic Alternative symbols along with what that show is about. So, for instance, last week's episode went up, and the visuals you'll see is episode 35 and then a list of the comics that we reviewed. But it will be the audio is the exact same thing as you hear if you listen to it through iTunes or our RSS feed. And, Andy, I did this because I know that there are a lot of people out there who really prefer to use YouTube for their audio and visual consumption. So if you want to listen to the podcast through iTunes, again, you know, you won't find a lot of sophisticated graphics or videos of you and I discussing things on the air. You'll just see one static image, but you can listen to the podcast that way.
Oh, yeah, that's a good option.
So, Andy, do you want to get into our publisher spotlight?
Yes, let's do.
One of the things that makes this publisher spotlight different and very special is we're doing something for the very first time. And Andy, I know that you and I have talked about this in the past, but I haven't done it yet. This time around, it was almost a last-minute decision. I decided that I wanted to talk with the publisher or someone at the publisher that we're discussing for this week's show and get a few words from him before we get to our reviews. So on Friday, I had the pleasure of talking to the founder, publisher, and you name it of Conundrum Press, and that is Andy Brown. So we're going to start off with my brief conversation with Andy Brown. So let's give that a listen.
Okay.
I have the pleasure of having on the podcast Andy Brown. He is the publisher and more of Conundrum Press. So, Andy, thank you for taking the time and talking with me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And so how many hats do you wear at Conundrum?
I wear every hat, yes, and socks and pants, and I wear the pants. I do pretty much everything except the social media stuff. I found a wonderful person to help me with that stuff, and I'm useless at it, so that's great. But I do pretty much a lot of the design and publicity and accounting and editing and everything, yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about the genesis of Conundrum Press. How long has it been around, and what has the publishing history been?
Sure. Well, it's not your typical comics press, I would imagine. I'm going to have my 20th anniversary next year.
Congratulations.
So I hope to do. Oh, thanks very much. I hope to do an anthology and stuff for that, but have a big blowout. But I started out doing little mini chapbooks of mostly fiction. I was a writer myself, and I was living in Montreal, and this is the early '90s. So it was there was Quebec was talking about separating from the rest of Canada, so the economy tanked, and there was really everything was really cheap, and artists all moved in and took over loft spaces and stuff. So there were a lot of sort of theater groups and spoken word and all this stuff. And so I was more involved in that, in the writing scene, and so I was publishing these chapbooks of short stories and fiction and stuff. But then I met a guy named Billy Mavreas, who's a Greek Montrealer, who did posters for shows, and I ended up doing a book of his posters in '97, I think, and they're kind of coming out of the psychedelic or underground comics. But he knew everybody in Montreal, so he introduced me to all the French cartoonists, all the English cartoonists, and it was when I saw the stuff the French cartoonists were doing, it just completely blew my mind, because I hadn't, it was very European. It was European mixed with North American stuff, and it was then I sort of gravitated. Oh yeah, this is something new. This is great. And I sort of gravitated more towards that. My background is I have a master's in English from a university in Concordia in Montreal. So I was coming out of a writerly background. But then I saw these comics and stuff. So I started doing about half and half, writing and comics and zines and collections and stuff. And then over the course of time, the novels and short stories were taking too much editorial time because I wasn't getting paid very much, obviously, or I wasn't paying myself very much. So I had to cut back on the editorial, and I realized that moving towards graphic novels exclusively would be helpful in so many ways, and it has. It's really paid off. So it's been about 5 years since I've been doing exclusively graphic novels, and almost exclusively Canadians, and now I've started doing some international books as well. Basically I do about 8 Canadian titles a year and 2 international a year for 10 books a year. It's kind of how it has been the last few years.
Wow. So another one of those hats that you wear at Conundrum is the founder.
Oh, yeah. It's a one-man operation. Oh, yeah, it's never been anybody else. Oh, yeah, 20 years. That's it. That's all I've ever done. Well, of course, I didn't pay myself for many, many, many years, so I was freelancing. But the thing about doing it this way, being a publisher and wearing all those hats, is you teach yourself. I had to teach myself how to do design and how to do accounting and how to do publicity. And so you gain all these skills, which you can then freelance. So I paid the bills by freelance editing and freelance design, mostly design, I guess, and these sorts of things. So
how difficult was it at first, if at all, to find authors for Conundrum? I mean, did you come to them? At what point did they start to come to you more?
I guess I've always pretty much gone to them. There's been, people have come to me, but it's very rare that anyone who comes to me, I decide to publish. It's usually, I must say that about, 70% of the stuff that I end up publishing is referred to me by someone else who I've already published, or, have great respect for it and is published by somebody else, like Koyama or D&Q or something. So those are the sort of artists now that I tend to take on because, they come with a recommendation. But it's also, you go to something like TCAF and you can sort of see who's got good mini comics, and it's like, oh, are you Canadian? Oh, go check out their website and buy the mini comics and support them, and just keep an ongoing dialogue, and and people keep producing work, and eventually they get to the level where they're putting out books. So I just kind of stick around. I guess after 20 years, I guess patience is one of my virtues.
Now, do you feel that, as the publisher, how do you feel that your visibility is, both in Canada and in the United States?
Well, in Canada, there's just like 2 or 3 comics publishers. One of the reasons I switched to comics also, there were so many reasons, but one was, it's very difficult publishing novels and short stories, although I love them and I love editing them and stuff. But it's just there's so many other larger presses with large budgets for publicity and writing festivals and front page reviews and magazines or whatever that I just couldn't compete. I can't compete with that sort of stuff. So you kind of get washed out. But doing comics, when you're one of 3 English Canadian publishers, then even though comics aren't reviewed as much in big papers and this and that, there's much more likely to be seen and stand out a little bit. In the States, I'm discovering now half my sales are actually in the States now, so my presence there has grown dramatically since, it was non-existent when I was doing fiction. And now that I'm doing comics, what I've discovered is that they just cross borders so much easier, and it doesn't really make a difference if you're Canadian or American. It's just there's so many more Americans, 10 times many is Americans, and 10 times more American presses. So you just get lost a little bit. But I think I just keep doing quality work. I think it's being noticed by people, and libraries and places like that are starting to buy the books and stuff. So that's great.
And one of the reasons why I ask is because before 2 or 3 years ago, I really didn't know much, if anything, about Conundrum. Now I did know the work of Michel
Rabagliati.
Yeah,
sure.
I'm sure I stumbled over his name. And I knew about. I remember getting The Obituary Man when it first came out, but it's only been over the past year and a half that I've really become aware of Conundrum. And in fact, we had a reviewer who sent us a review of one of your books last year, the photo booth book.
Sure.
Yeah, and then it was soon after that I reviewed your What We Need to Know. And it just seemed at that point I became more and more aware of the kind of things that you guys put out. And since then, I've been asking, let's say over the past year or so, people, do you know about Conundrum Press, or have you read the stuff that are coming out? Because at least from my standpoint, I can't speak, for a lot of people who primarily gravitate toward, let's say, non-mainstream or alternative, whatever you choose to call it, comics, indie. I immediately think of publishers like Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly. There are others.
Sure, of course. Everybody does. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And it's just, I felt that about a year and a half ago, Conundrum was a gigantic find for me, even though you've been out there for years. It was me who was finally becoming aware of everything you have coming out. To where now I find it very exciting, and exciting enough for us to do a publisher spotlight on Conundrum Press. Now, Andy, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the spring catalog you have now. In other words, the books that we're about to discuss on this show.
Sure. Well, we just debuted them all at TCAF, so that was a week ago. So I'm still in the glow of that. And in fact, the book, the photo booth book by Meg Fitzgerald, won the Doug Wright Award, which is the only Canadian Comics Award possible to win. So she won for the Spotlight Award, so that was great. She's actually up for an award tonight as well in Montreal, the Exposine Alternative Press Award. She's been nominated for Best Book. So tomorrow she might have a second award. I don't know, but anyway. But yeah, so that came out, that debuted at TCAF last year. And then, so this year at TCAF we had 4 artists were actually there. The big book that we had there was Dakota McFadzean, Don't Get Eaten by Anything, a collection of dailies. So he's done a daily webcomic, like a 4-panel webcomic for every day for 5 years, like 365 strips a year, which I think is an incredible feat. And so I had published a book of his short stories. He went to the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont. He's originally from the prairies in Canada, and he's a young guy, but he's a real talent. Like, he really understands comics and how they work and narrative language. And so this was a book of these dailies, like in full color hardcover book. So that did really well at TCAF, and I hope it continues to do well. We also debuted Zach Worton, who is known for doing The Klondike, which came out with John and Corley a few years ago. So he's got a new book, which is actually going to be a trilogy. So the first part of the trilogy came out, and it's called The Search for Charley Butters. The Disappearance of Charley Butters. The Search for Charley Butters is Volume 2, which comes out next year. And he's just a natural cartoonist. He's in Toronto. Really beautiful narrative storytelling style in comics. What else is there? There was Kat Verhoeven, who did, she had a group of minis called Towerkind, like Humankind, but Towerkind, about a group of kids living in a neighborhood that's made up exclusively of skyscrapers, which is a real neighborhood in Toronto called St. Jamestown, which I didn't know about, but she lived there. And it's kind of an otherworldly, end of the world narrative, and very small kind of pocketbook. That's done really well, actually. I had to reprint that one. So that was 3. Now you're going to have to remind me. Sorry?
There's Moose, and then Adventures of Drippy Boy, the Newsboy.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure, yeah.
Or Drippy the Newsboy, yeah.
Yeah, Adventures of Drippy the Newsboy was a character that this guy Julian Lawrence invented in Vancouver many years, like decade ago, and he had this Drippy Town Gazette, was this weird alternative free newspaper in Vancouver, that had bands and reviews and comics, and then he went on to do these comic anthologies, and so I was looking at these comic anthologies, and I'm like, the best stuff in here is by the editor, Julian, and so I contacted him, I said, do you have more of this stuff? He said, oh yeah, I have a whole book. In fact, it's a trilogy too. And so it's all based on the work of Stephen Crane. So the first one's called Drippy's Mama, and then the second book is coming out in the fall, and it's The Red Drip of Courage, which is based on Stephen Crane's book, The Red Badge of Courage. So it's, again, very cartoony. It's kind of done in like the Tintin album style, like 64-page, 7x10, not hardcovers, but that kind of adventure serial style. Mm-hmm. And then Moose is actually an international book, a guy by Max de I'm going to screw up his name, but Max de Radiguès, I guess, who runs actually L'Emploi de Moi, a publishing house in Belgium, which in French language. And he contacted me. He also went to the Center for Cartoon Studies with Charles Forsman, and so Charles Forsman's Oily Comics is a mini comic publisher, and so the Moose was actually originally serialized as these mini comics, and then it was published in French in France. And so he sent me the French book and he had the PDF of the English book, and he's like, how do you feel about this? And people said I should come to you, and I looked at it, and I was completely blown away. I mean, it's just kind of all takes place in a high school. It could be anywhere in the United States, anywhere in North America. And it's this bullying narrative about this kid who gets relentlessly bullied, but then the end, it gets completely turned on its head, and it's kind of this morally ambiguous ending that I won't spoil it for anybody. But I was completely blown away by his work, actually, and he has a bunch of other books in French, which I'm going to check out. So they all did well at TCAF.
Wow. So this is your spring release.
That's the springs, yeah.
Okay, so briefly, what books can we look forward to for fall and then into 2016?
Well, okay. So the Drippy Town Volume 2, the Red Drip of Courage, will be one of them. The big international book that I'm doing in September is going to be the Dharma Punks. So this is which I didn't really know much about, and then my foreign rights agent sent me this PDF, and it's this guy in New Zealand called Ant Sang, and I was like, what the heck is this? And it was this 400-page graphic novel, kind of done in the style of Paul Pope, but very reminiscent of Love and Rockets, and it was done in 1994. And it was just recently a Kickstarter in New Zealand got it published, just a New Zealand edition. So they were looking for a North American edition. So I was like, oh, this is amazing. And it all takes place in one night in Auckland. And it's this Buddhist punk who's supposed to blow up kind of like a Walmart at the end of the day. So it's very cinematic. It's like one day. And he's got to go through these punk nightclubs and get into all his mischief. But he's very torn based on his, he's a sensitive guy. He doesn't want to blow anybody up. He doesn't want to hurt anybody. But then there's these Nazis and skinheads. And anyway, it's an amazing book. And so that's the big one in coming out in the fall. And we're going to have an introduction by Dylan Horrocks, who did, obviously, Hicksville. So he's a big proponent of this book, and we'll be pushing it. So that's great. And then there's another book by Meg Fitzgerald, who did the photo booth book, called Long Red Hair, all about it's kind of a memoir and a historical document about red hair throughout culture and history. The mystique of red hair. So that's kind of a follow-up to her photo booth book, so that should be nice. And then another one we're doing is this guy in Montreal called Sherwin Tejia has been doing these books that are choose-your-own-adventure books told from the point of view of a cat. So we did You Are a Cat, and then the follow-up was You Are a Cat in the Zombie Apocalypse. And these are my best-selling titles of all time. I mean, you combine cats and zombies, and the internet breaks, right? So the prequel. So there's 3 in the series. Again, this is the year of the trilogy for Conundrum Press. So this is going to, for the final book in the trilogy, is going to come out. It's called You Are a Kitten. So it's the prequel to You Are a Cat. So I expect similar awesomeness and sales from that. And then I think, is this the last one? They were doing a book, kind of an alternative guide to Yellowknife called Ramshackle by a woman named Alison McCreesh, who's she's actually a French Canadian, but I mean the whole book's in English. It isn't translated or anything, but her blog and stuff's all in French. But it's kind of her memoir moving to Yellowknife. Now Yellowknife is a very, very, very northern city in the Northwest Territories in Canada. So it's all about living in this very high Arctic community, and sort of all the hijinks that entail and sort of how people live in make culture and stuff up there. So that's pretty much it for the fall. And then I don't know if anyone's counting, but that should have been 10 books. There should be 10 there.
Yeah.
And then coming up, so then next year, I'm actually planning next year because it is my 20th anniversary, so I'm going to kind of have everything planned well in advance and stuff. So today, actually, and yesterday, I was looking into, we're doing a book by this guy, Igor Hofbauer, the international book I'm going to do. And this is a person that Nina Bunjevic turned me on to, who did a book for me called Heartless. Mm-hmm. But she's just she's a Serbian, and she just came out with a book called Fatherland with Random House, which just won the Doug Wright Award for the best book, and it's just an incredible piece of work. It's hopefully it'll get a lot of really great attention because it deserves it.
Yeah, we reviewed that one on the show when it first came out.
There you go. Yeah, absolutely. So she's a lovely person. So this Igor Hopar is he's in Croatia. He's in Zagreb in Croatia. So this is a friend of hers and someone who she showed me some of his work. And he's just had he does poster design and stuff. But she calls him the Charles Burns of the Baltics. So that's kind of sums it up. That's a good way of putting it. And it's very dark and very Eastern European. And I just think it's amazing stuff. And it's not like anything else you've ever seen, except maybe like Charles Burns or something. Imagine Charles Burns if he was Croatian living in skyscrapers in Zagreb kind of thing, right? So that's one thing. So I'm excited about that. L'Association is going to do a French edition of his book, from what I understand. And then I'm going to do the second book in the series by Zach Worton called The Search for Charley Butters. And I should probably have a list in front of me of the books I'm going to do. But and then I'll do the big one, of course, is the next Michel Verbagliati book, which is coming out for the Salon de Livre in the fall. So we'll be doing the English edition in French, and we'll do the English edition in May for TCAF next year. That's the plan. So it's called Paul du Nord, Paul Up North, basically, would be the translation. And now whether it's going to stay, often the titles with his books change quite dramatically, but that's the idea. And then there's a bunch of stuff I'm just kind of thinking about.
Yeah, well, that's a lot. You got a lot out and a lot coming out, so there's a lot to look forward to. And I know that if our listeners are not familiar with Conundrum Press, they can go to your website or just do and do a Google search to find out all the great stuff that you guys have put out. And I know one thing I have to thank you for is 2 incredible interviews over the past 6 or 7 months. I was pleased to have Dakota McFadzean on the show, on the podcast, and then I think it's the longest text interview I ever did. Came out earlier this year with Joe Ullman, and that was loads of fun.
Yeah, those are 2 of the hardest working cartoonists I've ever met, hardest working people I've ever met, frankly, and 2 of the nicest, greatest guys in the world. Yeah, so that's great. Yeah, happy to be publishing them for sure.
Yeah, and Andy, we want to thank you for helping to make this publisher spotlight possible. So we look forward to discussing the books on the show.
I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Wow, Derek, I'm really glad that you spoke with Andy. That was really good.
Yeah, he was fun to talk with, and not only giving us a little background on where Conundrum came from. I didn't know that he really started this from scratch, but he did. He built this with his own 2 hands. But he also told us a little bit of information about the titles that we're about to discuss. And so I think that's a great context to begin. And the first book that we're going to be discussing, this is, again, from their spring catalog, and there are 5 books. But the first one is Zach Worton's The Disappearance of Charley Butters. Now, Andy, had you heard of Zach Worton before?
I had seen his graphic novel, The Klondike, which I think came out 2011 or 12. Was it Drawn and Quarterly that published it?
Fantagraphics.
Was it Fantagraphics that published it?
Yes.
But I never did read that, so I knew.
Oh, no, it's Drawn and Quarterly. You're right, Drawn and Quarterly.
Okay. So I have not read it, so this is actually my first exposure to his work.
Yeah, and I knew about that. I haven't, unfortunately, read The Klondike yet, but so I guess my official introduction to Worton's work is The Disappearance of Charley Butters. Now, what are your thoughts on this book? Do you feel that... maybe a place to begin is what happens in The Disappearance of Charley Butters. What is this book about?
Yeah, well, I'll be glad to give listeners the setup. We start the graphic novel in the woods, and there's a van driving through the woods, and there's a man wearing a cap, looks very ordinary, and he's saying, "All right, let's get this over with, jerks." And we see in the back of the band that there is a black metal band. These guys that are into metal, and their director is actually, or the cameraman is actually trying to get them to hurry up because the available daylight isn't going to last forever. Anyway, they're there to film a video, and they find this shack on location, and they didn't know they were going to encounter this, and it's a shack filled with notebooks, unopened soup cans from the 1950s, and hundreds of the same painting over and over and over. And so the guys are really interested in what happened here. What are all these notebooks? And one of the band members named Randall starts picking up these notebooks, and they're notebooks from a painter named Charley Butters. And this chronicles like so much of Charley Butters' life, and Randall starts really getting into these notebooks. Of course, the band shoots their video, and they wrap that up. But Randall is still obsessed with what is going on in these notebooks. And through these notebooks, we learn a little bit, but there's a huge mystery in the disappearance of Charley Butters that goes beyond just the title. Who was he? Why did he disappear? There's much, much more to it than that. And that is the basic thrust of the story.
Yeah, and that's it. So, now you say the main character's name is not Charley Butters, but is it Randall or Stewart?
Well, Stewart is really the guy that's trying to corral all these guys in the metal band into something that he.
Oh, that's
use.
right. Okay. Well,
yeah, Stewart's the guy.
No, it's Travis, not Randall. Travis.
Yeah. Now Travis. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Randall reads the notebooks, but Travis is the one that really gets obsessed with them.
Okay, so yeah, that's where there are a lot of characters in the book, or at least to the initial setup. So I wanted to make sure that at least I was on the right page.
My mistake.
Yeah, so Travis is, at least what I gather from this book, is that he is the main protagonist. We have other characters who are quite prominent as well, but if this book is about Charley Butters, or at least indirectly about Charley Butters, then I think it's more directly about Travis. Because one of the things we find as we move through the text is that Travis becomes more enmeshed, more interested in these diaries of Charley Butters, to where by the end of the book it's as if he is feeling himself becoming an expert on Charley Butters and who this guy actually was. And in fact, toward the end of the book, he and Stewart's wanting to make a documentary about this Charley Butters figure because, he's intrigued by him as well. This artist figure from earlier in the century. They go to talk with Butters's, I want to say widow. I think they assume widow. I'm assuming widow, but his former wife. Okay, right. Because we don't know what happened to Charley Butters, and they don't get very far. And the wife is also still angry after all those years of Charley leaving her. And from what we can gather in this book, Charley left her not because of another woman or not to run off and, gamble his life away, but because he wanted to be by himself and to find himself along with, his art as well. Again, we don't know a lot of the details here, and I'm assuming that a lot of this will come out in the next two books. And it's worth mentioning that The Disappearance of Charley Butters is the first of a planned trilogy, and this is something that Andy Brown had mentioned in our conversation. So there's more to this story to come. And in fact, when I was first reading The Disappearance of Charley Butters, and this is before I spoke with Andy Brown, one of the things that I usually don't do, you remember that scene in When Harry Met Sally, when Billy Crystal, his character, says that he turns to the very end of a book to find out how it ends?
Yeah.
I don't do that. So I did not know that at the very end of this book it says, coming soon, the search for Charley Butters. And in the last pages, this didn't seem like it was going to wrap up anytime soon. And so it had about 3 or 4 more pages to go. And I thought, how the hell are they going to wrap up this story? So I was a little surprised when I got to this coming soon, anticipating the second book in the trilogy. But there you go. So this is another thing to look forward to, is to see how this story ends, or at least continues.
I had the same feelings about the book too, because I thought this was going to be a one volume story. And like you, I was thinking, this thing's not getting wrapped up anytime soon. It doesn't look like. So you think, as you get closer to the end, you think, oh, okay, there's going to be just a quick wrap up ending that the book doesn't deserve, or it's going to have additional volumes, and this one will, as you said, have additional volumes. I think there's some. I think that was part of my expectation going into the book, because as we're going on, you see a lot of scenes with members of the metal band arguing with each other. Part of that is to set up character, to get you to give you a feel of what these guys are like, especially Travis. Initially, I thought that too much time was spent on those scenes. But since this is going to be a trilogy, that didn't, once I got to the end of it, that didn't bother me as much.
You mean the opening scenes where the metal band is out getting ready to shoot their video?
Not so much those, but the ones that come after that. I mean, we get a lot of scenes that really seem to go on for quite a while, where the band members are arguing with each other. One of the guys gets thrown into jail, and another guy has to get him out, and there's a lot of drama associated with that. There's another scene where Travis meets a girl, a previous friend. So there's all these relationship things that are going on, and they're important to the story. I just felt like some of them went on a little bit longer, especially when I thought that this was going to be a one-volume story.
I guess within the context of thinking this was going to be a one-volume story, that makes sense. But, I really like the way that character is fleshed out in The Disappearance of Charley Butters, even with the long scenes we have among the various band members. Because for me, it all comes back to Travis. If he is the main character in this story, which I'm assuming he is and is going to continue to be, because he is so directly linked to Charley Butters. I mean, not only is he the one who has gone back to the forest to get those diaries and take them back and to enmesh himself in Charley's diaries, but you can tell that he is starting to transform after he starts reading those journals. Mm-hmm. I mean, case in point, he cuts his hair. Mm-hmm. In the early pages, he has this long kind of headbanger, heavy metal hair that I think a woman who eventually becomes his girlfriend, and also the woman who cuts his hair says, it's about time you decided to get a haircut. So he's been growing his hair for a very long time. So this is a profound change for him in life, to have his hair cut, and that tells us something about how he is changing. And he does look quite different. He also becomes involved with this one woman, Kate, or maybe Kat, K-A-T. He becomes involved with her, so you can see how his life is changing in that way. So as he learns more about Charley Butters, and I'm assuming that this will intensify in the search for Charley Butters, he's changing. Now, getting back to those scenes with the metal band, you get to see him and the conflicts within the band. He kind of stands out. He's becoming his own person. Mm-hmm. When we first see the metal band at the very beginning, there is Stewart, who's the film guy and who's driving everyone out in this van, and then the others, right? That's the band, the three guys. And they seem like all of a kind, doing the same thing. But then as the story starts to unfold, the individual characters within the band seem to stand out, most prominent of which is Travis. Mm-hmm. So he's growing apart from the band, and from what we can see in this first volume, the band breaks up. And this is not a spoiler because it happens about halfway through. They can easily get back together in the second book, who knows. But it just all goes to show how Travis especially is really defining himself or distinguishing himself from his friends in the band, and also from some of the people that he works with. He works in a record store.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned transformation, because definitely Travis is going through a transformation here. And again, I think that's why a lot of those scenes with the band, especially the band member Mike, who just seems to be just a lazy guy that just doesn't do anything with his life, and Travis seems to be separating himself from that and transforming himself, as you said. But also we get the sense that there is that connection to Charley Butters, because we do witness through his journals that the part of the transformation that he has gone through. Now, we don't get the full story yet. And in that way, The Disappearance of Charley Butters is kind of something of a Blair Witch Project. Has that type of feel to it. Not to compare it to, I hate comparing one genre or one thing to another thing that doesn't have one graphic novel to a movie. But there's a little bit of that going on. So I think there's a lot of really, really good things that have been set up here. I also wanted to point out that while Travis is having all of these things, these transformations going on, there's a lot of reflective time in this comic. You see a lot of silent panels that depict the passage of time, and they also depict the fact that Travis is kind of dwelling on and kind of meditating on all of the things that he's picked up. I think that's a very, very effective use of that technique by Zach Worton. That works really, really well. That's not to say that this is a that it's text light. I mean, there's plenty of text in here. There's plenty of dialogue, but the use of those silent panels, I think, is very, very well done.
I agree, and in fact, the Disappearance of Charley Butters, in that sense, bears quite a number of similarities to the next one that we're going to discuss. And I'm not meaning this as a segue at this very moment, but I think in the next book, Moose, we find something very similar going on in that the pacing is slower, and not in a bad way. One of the things that I think is common among most American comics, especially mainstream comics, it's action-based. Mm-hmm. Action. And, if you recall from Scott McCloud's seminal Understanding Comics, one of the things he does is he points out, the way that he sees it at least, the different kinds of transition between panels. Mm-hmm. And an action-to-action transition where you go from one panel, which is an action, to another panel, which is an action. That tends to give you a faster pace in a particular text. It's quite a bit different from a scene-to-scene aspect ratio where you have a number of panels where not much action takes place, but you may have, let's say, a panel that demonstrates some action, and then the next panel is a scene, and then maybe the next panel is part of that same scene but from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And then maybe a third panel would be somewhat of the same scene but maybe up close or at least from a distance. In other words, there's more of a prominence of panel transition where there is a scenic context put into play. And so what that does is that usually allows for a slower pacing in terms of the action, but it also gives you a fuller sense. In other words, it's almost like, if I can use this metaphor, with another medium, pulling the camera back to show the larger picture, where you're not just focused in on the main action taking place. So I do appreciate that, and that's not a lot. That's not a characteristic that you'll find in a lot of American comics. And, it's worth pointing out something that, of course, Andy Brown brought up in our conversation that we heard earlier, but we haven't mentioned this yet, is that Conundrum Press is a Canadian publisher. And I don't want to suggest that there is a different mindset or a different sense of how to create comics in Canada that's different from the States. I don't necessarily think it's that simple. But with some of these creators, there is definitely a different mindset that we have in the books that we're discussing today. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that all of these creators, American, Canadian, and European, as we'll get in with the next book, they are not. They come from a different background of creating comics that's definitely outside of at least the United States mainstream. And so I think that's where this sensibility comes in.
I think you're onto something there, Derek, because and I think readers that do experience even one or two of these books, if not all five, and I think you should experience all five, will find that there's something different there. I can only think of one of the comics that we're going to look at today that does not really fall into that mode, but is fairly quick-paced, which we'll get to. But yeah, there are so many scenes in this book and in Moose, the one we're going to look at next, that I don't want to say leisurely tell a story, but they're you're meant to pick up something besides plot. You're meant to pick up something besides character, although those things are going on. A lot of really good prose writers will tell you sentences should do more than one thing. And I think you see this in this comic. You see the panels doing more than one thing. They're doing more than plot. They're doing more than character. They're doing more than setting. They're also giving you something a little intangible that may not be as easy to articulate, but it's definitely there.
And in fact, I think one way of describing what some of these books do, and you're right, there's one that is a little different in terms of the pacing, and I think I know which one you're talking about. We're going to get to that soon. Is that these stories, at least the first two books that we're discussing, The Disappearance of Charley, Butters, and Moose, they allow the story to breathe more. Mm-hmm. So there's, again, there's more of a sense of narrative expansion.
Yes.
In that sense. Now, we've been teasing the book Moose. So you want to go ahead and get into that, or are there any final words on The Disappearance of Charley Butters?
No, that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about it. I think, again, my preconceptions with the book were I thought this was all going to be contained in one volume, and it was not. So I don't want to say that the first read-through was a little disappointing, but it was just a little bit unexpected.
Okay.
But yes, I do recommend it.
So let's get to the second book that we're discussing, also a spring release, as all of the titles we're discussing today. And this is Moose. This is by Max, and I hope I get the last name correct. Max de Radiguès, Radigues, and I think the E has a grav over it. So, Max de Radiguès. So now this one I've noticed on the cover. I didn't notice this until just now. It says Conundrum International as opposed to Conundrum Press. And if you'll recall, one of the things that Andy Brown mentioned in our conversation is that not only is he publishing the work of North American, primarily Canadian, comics artist with Conundrum, but he's also been getting more and more European creators. And so de Radiguès is one of these as well. So this is previously published originally in French, but now it is translated into English. And also it came out through Oily Comics in like individual magazine form. I think there were 14 issues of Moose, and we get a gallery of the various covers at the very end of the book. So this is one of those stories that, we're mentioning the slower, more even pacing of Charley Butters. Same thing with Moose. Mm-hmm. And the timeline in Moose is even more contained than the timeline of action we find going on in The Disappearance of Charley Butters. So what happens in Moose? Without giving anything away, because this is one of those books that has we could easily spoil.
We could. So yeah, there's probably not an awful lot we can say about it, but I will give you a little bit about it. First, I wanted to mention that the book starts with a dedication to Alec Longstreth, who we have had on the show before.
Yeah, that's cool.
And I thought that was interesting because I thought I saw some faint similarities to Longstreth's work Basewood, which we've looked at on the show last year, I guess that was. Anyway, Moose takes place in what appears to be a small Canadian town, and we see a young man named Joe, a boy, and he's very reluctant to go to school or take the bus to school. He would rather walk. Soon we learn that Joe is trying to avoid a bully at school named Jason, and Jason is quite sadistic, and without telling you too much about it, Joe begins to learn more about the natural world and becomes interested more in the natural world, nature, where things seem to be more quiet, peaceful. His interests lie in that, and those things start getting developed as he's being bullied by this boy named Jason. And to tell you too much more would, like Derek said, really be spoiler territory.
Yeah, I think the main point of this story that you emphasized is that it's all about bullying, right? I mean, that is the premise upon which Moose is based on. But I think another important component to this, and I don't think it's a spoiler by giving this away, is that the book is called Moose for a reason, that a moose appears in the book, and we see Joe encounter the moose at the very beginning. As you recalled, or as you were mentioning, at the beginning of the story, Joe is trying to avoid Jason, and one way of doing that is not riding the bus, because Jason is on the bus, and so he doesn't want to be bullied on the bus by Jason. So he walks to school, and he does so by cutting through a wooded area, a little forested area between his house and the school that he attends. And on this particular morning, he comes up against a moose, and the moose just looks at him and then moves away. The moose comes back with a vengeance in the last half of the story. Now, I won't tell you how the moose comes back, because that would be approaching spoiler territory. But let's just say that the moose, or the book titled Moose, earns that title in the last pages of, or at least the last third of this graphic novel.
Yeah.
So it's about how Joe deals with bullying, how sadistic a character he is, Jason, how sadistic a character he is. And not only with Joe, but you can also see where Jason is a bit of a tyrant with other students at the school as well. And along with this, how, if not clueless, then ineffective many of the teachers are in terms of dealing with the bully Jason. And that's one of the things that struck me so, and that is how the teachers could be completely ignorant of this, or if not ignorant, because the one teacher that is with him there in detention at one point, and I can't remember that teacher's name. He's the one that has the bumpy nose. He suspects that he's being bullied and is wanting Joe to tell him or confide in him, but Joe says at one point, "You know that I can't." And maybe this is the adult me speaking now, because I was one of those kids who was bullied when I was in high school and junior high to a lesser degree. Well, no, high school to a lesser degree, but junior high definitely. And there was one guy in particular, and I'm not going to mention his name. I'm sure he doesn't listen to the podcast. I have since forgiven him. Curiously, his name is Charley, not Butters.
Yeah.
And I remember when years ago, when a lot of my high school friends from West Mecklenburg were getting on Facebook and everybody was connecting, this Charley, asked to connect with me, and I refused. I think maybe I did accept it because I thought, okay, so much time has gone by.
Yeah.
And, he was a jerk then. He may realize that he's a jerk. But anyway, the older me looking at Moose, I asked myself, why doesn't Joe say something or do something? Actually, Joe does try to do something, as we find out in the last half of the book. But, it's really sad that the authority figures at school, the adults, just aren't able to do much. In the case of some of them, aren't aware, and maybe they choose not to be aware. I don't know. But that's one of the sad parts of Moose.
And, one of the interesting things that I don't know, too, about, the culture of public schools in Canada is, I'm sure bullying transcends all borders, but I wonder how prevalent, if it's more prevalent there than it is here, it's more here than there. Again, bullying is everywhere, but you do wonder how it's handled from place to place. And as you said, it seems that either the teachers in this comic are either kind of looking the other way, or maybe they're not sure what to do. We just don't know. But there's definitely that tone of something's not being done that needs to be done. So I think that's a definite component of the book. Again, one of the things about Moose that really I think is, without giving anything away, I think one of the main thrusts of the book is is here is Joe that's wanting to escape from this torture. And again, Jason, I would say Jason's one of the most sadistic child characters we've seen in comics in quite a while. But he wants to escape that, and he's learning. I think we could tell this one part that he's, like you said, he's in detention, where he has to copy articles from the National Geographic and like magazines. Magazines like that. And there's one humorous thing in there that we all see in National Geographic at some point as kids. But there's a sense that Joe learns about. Yes, he wants to be part more of the natural world, but he also learns that there's another side to that natural world. And it can be dangerous, and I'm going to leave it at that. But I think maybe that may be one of the most important aspects of understanding moose, is to understand the aspects of the natural world and how they affect us.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're emphasizing nature in the natural world, and you did when you were setting up the story, and I think that's important, because that's where the moose comes in. But it's more than just the moose, but I think the moose, the actual moose in the story, stands for, in one way, nature in a larger sense, right? Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to look at the moose and say, oh, he's soft, he's cute looking, and, I just want to pet him. Mm-hmm. But, moose can get violent. And I'm not necessarily just talking about this story, but in nature, in reality, they can become violent. And so that does tell us something about nature. It may be inviting and cute, if seen one way, but there is a darker underside to this, and a darker underside in terms, not because of choice or intention, but it's just the way it is. And I think that in the second half of this book especially, we're thrust into the natural world in a way that really does make this story turn quite a bit darker. Now, again, not wanting to go into details because I don't want to spoil anything, but I also think it's important, and it's not spoiling, by saying that one of the darker aspects of this story in the last half is a moral dilemma that Joe has to go through. Mm-hmm. And so, for me, the strength of this narrative is in that last half. The first half is important because it sets up everything. Mm-hmm. But then the last half is Joe dealing with a moral dilemma, and that's what is at the heart of Moose. And in fact, this book does not have page numbers, so it's not like I can say that the climax takes place at the exact center of the book. But if I open up the book and I turn to an occasion in the woods when Joe is walking home and Jason confronts him, and I hold the book to the side, I can see that the number of pages on one half are comparable to the rough number of pages in the other half. So I think it's safe to say that the climax of this story takes place at the very center. So if I were going to map out the action of Moose in a Freytag triangle, where the climax, the highest point of all the building action leads to that heightened point, it comes in the middle. Mm-hmm. And then everything after that is a series of falling action, and that is where the moral dilemma comes in, and where things get darker as we get toward the resolution here. And I think one of the things I love about Moose is that we don't have any kind of neat, tied-up resolution. Mm-hmm. Things are just left hanging.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I wanted to mention a little bit about the art. I know I didn't say anything really about the art in Charley Butters, but what we have here, de Radiguès, I'm sorry for mispronouncing, he normally gives us 6-panel grids, and it's pretty much straightforward.
Pretty consistent, yeah.
Yeah, pretty consistent. And the art is very, what I would call, thin line. There aren't a lot of bold strokes. It's very thin lines, but very effective, especially in depicting all of the characters, but especially Joe. He does this with, a lot of the characters are depicted with kind of shaky arms and legs, kind of like they're wobbly. And this really accentuates the character's fragility. So the way that he draws this really works well, because we get the feeling that everybody here, all of these characters, especially the children, are almost walking on eggshells, not just because there's a bully around, but just because this is just the part of growing up that's so fragile.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. Another thing I noticed about De Radiguès is his artwork. It is very iconic and simple, and I mean simple not in a pejorative sense.
Not simplistic.
Yeah, it's not simplistic, but it's simple. Okay, and I think it's quite effective. And in fact, it reminds me of Kalchanka's art to some degree, and also a little bit of Brian Lee O'Malley, at least in terms of Joe and the way that he's drawn. Now, I don't think that this is derivative in any way, but another thing that distinguishes some of this art, I think, is a variety of the characters' noses, especially Jason's, is quite pointy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we also found this in Zach Worton's Charley
right.
Butters.
Yeah.
So a lot of pointy noses this week.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, but yeah, it is an effective style, and I think that the simple art, in some ways, kind of sets up the darker moral dilemmas that are in this last half of the book. By contrast, right? Because you see this art, and I think by looking at it initially, I would think that I would say that it's, before reading the story, it's kind of light, and again, not in a negative sense, but not heavy. This is going to be kind of a straightforward story, not one that would include a lot of moral or psychological agonizing. But that's what happens. And so I think the contrast of the art and then the message or messages that we could tease out in the last half of this book, that contrast is quite stark and I think effective.
I think so too. And again, this is a good comparison to the Disappearance of Charley Butters. And you have a lot of scenes where the creator is really taking his time with the story, and he's allowing you to experience a lot of things that aren't necessarily plot driven. We're absorbing this atmosphere. We're absorbing what's happening to Joe, and we're just kind of soaking in it. And it's something that just, both of these creators want us to live in this world for a little bit. We're not in any hurry to get to the end, and I appreciate that.
Same here. So, Andy, do you want to get to the third book that we're going to be discussing today?
Yes.
And this is Kat Verhoeven's Towerkind or Towerkind. Now, when I was speaking with Andy Brown earlier, he pronounced it Towerkind. And as he mentioned, it's like humankind, Towerkind. I thought, and I think you thought as well, when we were talking before the recording, it was pronounced Towerkind because it deals with children.
Right. That's the way I was pronouncing it, so I'm going to try to pronounce it in Andy Brown's way of Towerkind.
Yeah. Well, I think it just as easily could be Towerkind.
Yeah.
As well. So, now, I think this book is going to be a little more difficult to describe than the other two.
It is in some ways. I don't know. We'll see. I want to point out too, and Derek, you probably knew this as well, but that and is it pronounced Kat Verhoeven?
Kat, I guess Verhoeven.
Well, Kat Verhoeven is actually Towerkind was nominated for an Ignatz Award for Outstanding Series last year. Mm-hmm. Which I had known but didn't register. And she also does a webcomic called Meat and Bone. Now, the setup of Towerkind or Towerkind is this is about the kind of the neighborhood in Toronto where there are all these low-rent dwellings, low-rent towers. And actually, Verhoeven lived in one of these for 4 years.
Yeah, St. James's Town.
Yeah, according to the foreword. What happens here is a lot of really strange events. And again, Derek, you're right. There's I'm not sure how much we can get into. But we see a lot of different children. And by children, I usually mean it looks like these kids are teenagers, maybe pre-teenagers. Some of them are smaller children. But these children are from all kinds of different ethnic backgrounds. We've got a young man at the beginning named Ty, and he has proclaimed himself the king of the tower, a king of the tower's neighborhood. And he's telling people to gather all of these things to build his castle. There's another young man named Moses, who is a German young man, and he's pretty much a bookworm who can't really get interested in obeying anything that Ty is commanding him to do. There is a young Muslim girl named Dina, who has kind of a friendship with Moses. There's another young girl named Mackenzie who speaks to dead animals. And that's really interesting. An Indian woman named Maha, and there are two young boys named Duke and Daniel. And those two boys have a near-death experience in the book, and that causes a unusual relationship to occur between them. Again, all of these children are living in these towers in this Toronto neighborhood, and they all sense that something is wrong. And I really don't want to say an awful lot more than that about it.
Yeah, but it's not just that. I mean, this is not a small scale something is wrong.
Right.
This is a large scale something is wrong, not just with this block or just with this neighborhood. We're talking about the entire world.
Yeah, this is like catastrophic level type of stuff.
And it gets a little freaky. And when I first read this, I had to go back. There were a number of sections where I went back and reread parts just to make sure that I was on the same page as Verhoeven was in telling the story. We don't want to give anything away, but we can say that there is a tragedy, a catastrophe that is about to happen, and the kids become aware of this. And one of the things that struck me about this story is the actual kids who are aware that something is going on, and it's almost as if they have some kind of other sense that the other children or other people do not. Maha, I think, has a sense and sees things in ways that scare her. It's like she has this sixth sense or ability in some way to see that something's about to happen. Dina, the Muslim girl you had mentioned, is another one who has a sense that something tragic is about to occur, because when we first see her encounter Moses, she's showing him things that really are surprising to him, but it's almost as if she's pointing out things like, see, these are the signs. Are you reading the signs? And he doesn't know what to make of them.
Yeah.
And I think even Mackenzie, to maybe a lesser degree, but still is someone who can see in things a message of what may come. And all of these three characters, Maha, Dina, and Mackenzie, it's not like they know exactly what's going to happen, but they sense that something is going to happen. And I find it curious that it's the female children in this story that have this ability.
Yeah.
I don't want to suggest that the other kids don't think that something is going to be happening or that they're not special in any way, but it's curious that it's the female characters who are sensing that something is about to happen, and they seem to be the most effective at bringing people together. And you contrast that with what's his name, the king at the very beginning?
Ty.
Yeah, you contrast that with Ty, who tries to bring people together in a very masculine way, right? By saying, I am in charge, you do this. And so instead of asking people to read things in a particular and maybe a different way, to look at the world differently, he's telling people to look at things his way and commanding from on high that this is the way that things should be. This is the way you put things together. This is the way that you establish power and make sense of things. Whereas these other characters, Maha, Dina, and Mackenzie, their way of interacting is markedly different.
Yeah. There's a scene where Mackenzie is talking to Ty, and again, without going into too much, she's telling him, stop being angry. You have to be bigger than that. There's a reason for all this. And as you said, she understands a little bit more what's going on than Ty does. And what's Ty's response? Stop talking riddles. I command it. he's just that type of guy that's a natural leader, but he's a leader without really thinking things through. He just wants things to happen. And the like you said, mostly the girls in this book are thinking a little bit more, or a lot more, than Ty is, and they're thinking there's something going on that you're missing, and you need to stop doing what you're doing and trying to control everything, and take a look at what's going on around you.
Exactly. Now, on the topic of Ty, the guy who wants to take charge of everything, he opens this story after the four, or at least the comic proper. He's saying, "This is my kingdom. Call me the All King and bow. Now you go away, you all." And he's commanding people to do this and that. I tell you what it reminded me of, and you tell me if I'm off base. Some of the work of Gilbert Hernandez.
I didn't have that written down, but that was one of the things that I was thinking of too, especially the second time through reading this. Yeah, it was Gilbert Hernandez.
Yeah, and the way that Gilbert writes so effectively about children's lives. I'm not talking about the adults in Palomar or his stories after Palomar. For instance, the Maria M., the most recent stuff that's going on there, or the Fritz stories. But when he's dealing with children, and we saw this, I think, quite markedly with last year's Marble season, or the year before that's Marble season, and then last year's Bumperhead. We were dealing with kids and the politics and the sociology of children's interaction. I see a lot of that going on in Towerkind. So I wonder if Verhoeven was influenced in any way by the art of Gilbert Hernandez. Not the actual art style, but the way that he represents children and the way that they interact, because it's that's one of the first things that occurred to me. And also, there's something kind of fantastical about the work of Gilbert Hernandez. I was about to say magical realist about it. I hesitate to say that, though, because I found that, and I think magical realism may be one way of effectively describing the work of Gilbert Hernandez, but it seems like that term, magic realism, is thrown around a little too easily whenever you're dealing with a Latino or a Latina artist. Yeah. So just because they're Latino or Latina doesn't necessarily mean they write in a magical realist way, even though a lot of magical realism does have a basis in South American fiction, right? As well as filmmaking. So anyway, that's why I chose the word fantastical, but and there's a lot of that fantasticalness going on here in Towerkind.
And Derek, we talked about the first two books, The Disappearance of Charley Butters and Moose, about those being a little bit slower paced, a little bit more reflective. This comic is not that way. There is constantly something going on. You have this impending sense that something, again, catastrophic is about to happen. But, one of the things that I find fascinating about this is we see these very personal, intimate little stories between these characters, and it's not normally what we will see in something that we might call apocalyptic literature, end of the world type stories or anything like that. These are very, very intimate little scenes between usually just one or two characters. And seldom in the book do we see all the characters together. It's usually shots of just one or two or three conversing with each other. And as you mentioned, the art style, like you said, it's simple without being simplistic, but it usually consists of very little background detail. We see lots of whites, we see lots of blacks, and I don't mean that to be critical, but the look of the art. Again, I don't mean this to be critical. The art looks like it's something that has been drawn quickly. And by that I mean no criticism, but it means that there seems to be a bit of urgency to the situations that we're in. Each of these panels seems to convey some sense of urgency. And all the characters seem to be seeking something that keeps us reading quickly. And the thing is, you'll probably want to read this comic again from the beginning as soon as you finished it once you get to the end. It is very fast-paced. It kind of wants you to read it quickly, but I think it wants you to spend some more time with it after you've read it that initial time.
Exactly. And I know that you're reading from a PDF, but the actual physical copy of this book is in smaller mini-comic size. So it's one of those that it's almost as if you could pick it up and put it in your pocket. It's that small. But, I mean, there's a lot that goes on in this small package. And the style, you were mentioning Moose and the way that the panel grids were on each page. Here you have a fairly consistent 4-panel page grid for the style. Now, there are some variations to this, but for the most part, you find 2 rows and 2 columns of 2 panels and rows of 2 panels each. And so, it's kind of a basic, straightforward, square 4-panel page. And the book is almost square. But, it's something that you can quickly read through it or reread through it. But I think that may lead you to think that there's not much that goes on in the story. But for all of its simpleness, and again, we were talking about this with Radiguès's Moose, that for all of its simpleness, there's quite a bit of complexity that goes on in the story proper, the telling of the story.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned the way that the panels are set out, because I actually went through the comic again, looking just at that, and in the beginning, we do get several consecutive pages of 4-panel grids and an occasional 3-panel page. But as the book progresses, as things start to pick up, we rarely get more than 2 consecutive pages of 4 panels. Usually 3 or 2-panel pages, or just a 1 splash page panel. And that gives us not only a more intimate look at the characters and their situations, but it also gives a maximum impact as we go through, especially the second half of the book.
Yeah, and you're right. There is a shift in panel page style, but it nonetheless, I think, retains that as a basis, because when there is variation in the paneling on a page, many times it's a combination of, let's say, at least 2 of those panels. So you may have one panel that takes up a horizontal row at the top of the page, and then there are at the bottom of the page those 2 panels again, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you do have a combination of both, 2 long horizontal panels, but even then, it's just a variation on this simple 4-panel grid. Mm-hmm. And it's a rarity that you have any kind of variation. For instance, angular panels. There are a few places, but it's not often.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, Derek, this Towerkind exceeded my expectations, and it constantly kept me guessing. When I thought I knew where it was going, it went somewhere else, actually somewhere better than I had imagined, and it gave me a lot to think about.
Mm. So is this one of your favorites from the spring catalog of Conundrum?
I would like to read them all again, but I think right now this is at the top of my list.
Okay. Well, Andy, before we get into a discussion of the last 2 titles from Conundrum's spring release, let's remind everyone that we're sponsored by Audible. Audible is offering our listeners a free audiobook of your choice and a free 30-day trial membership. Just go to their website, www.audibletrial.com, and then / Comics Alternative, which is our account, and from there you can choose over 180,000 audio programs. Download a title for free and start listening. It's just that easy. So go to audibletrial.com / Comics Alternative. That's audibletrial.com / Comics Alternative and get started today.
Cool.
The next book, and this is going to be fun to discuss, is by Julian Lawrence, and it is The Adventures of Drippy, the Newsboy. And the subtitle of this one is Drippy's Mama. And, as you heard in my conversation at the beginning of the show with Andy Brown, this is another first in a trilogy from Conundrum. And this volume, Drippy's Mama, is based on Stephen Crane's George's Mother. And then the other 2 books are also going to be based off of Stephen Crane narratives. And so this next one, Andy said, is based off of The Red Badge of Courage. And I think that's interesting, especially given the fact that of all the books that we're looking at today from Conundrum, This is the one that is the most cartoony.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't mean that in a negative sense, but this is something that could easily be a cartoon because the protagonist, Drippy, and I love that name, I mean, his head is in the shape of a drip of water or like a tear. And, of course, that becomes significant at the very end. But he is a character with a water drop for a head, thus his name, Drippy. And in fact, most of the characters, not all, but most of them are drip-type characters. And so the name sounds fun. The art is fun. This could be a cartoon on maybe Adult Swim, and probably Adult Swim and not just Cartoon Network, because there is something dark and explicit about some of this stuff. But it is a very fun story. Now, the book is around the size of European albums, so it has that feel to it, something like Tintin. And in fact, if you remember, Andy Brown did mention Tintin when referencing Julian Lawrence's comics. So, okay, this is funny. What happens in Drippy's Mama?
Well, a lot does. A lot of drinking happens in Drippy's Mama. It's funny because the comic starts out with a full page of Drippy singing and playing his guitar on the street corner, and he's got his foot on top of a stack of newspapers, and he's singing a song. And I'm not going to sing it for you, but just a couple of lines. Oh, come on. No. I sell the morning paper. My name's Drippy. I walk around. Everybody knows that I'm the newsboy of Drippy Town. And it goes on, and this is actually based on a real song by the Carter family. And if you know the Carter family, you know that they became famous pretty much during the end of the Great Depression in this country. They were from the Appalachian, Virginia. And the actual song that they did was called Jimmy Brown the Newsboy. So it's kind of a takeoff on that. And most of the Carter family music was, to be pretty honest, was pretty bleak. Because those were pretty bleak times. But a lot of those were based on spirituals, church songs, hymns, that type of thing. But this one is kind of played for laughs here at the beginning of Drippy, and it kind of sets the tone for what's going to happen after that. Well, we see at the very first, after we get the musical interlude or the musical introduction, we see Drippy walking through town, and there are large wrapped candy wrappers and candy canes leaning against buildings. So you know this is almost like a fantasy world. Drippy meets this guy named Harry who looks like a hobo, and Harry buys Drippy a drink, and Harry tells Drippy to come to the new Jolly Boys Club at the bar later. And soon we find out that Drippy is the last surviving brother of 5, and he's living with his mom. And his mom and he are quite different. The mom wants him to go with her to prayer meetings, but Drippy really is not interested because he'd rather be drinking with the guys. So we have this setup here of conflict immediately, that Drippy really just wants to have a good time. His mom wants him to, settle down and be a good boy. And that's basically how the story begins. And Derek, I'll let you take it from there.
Well, I love this book. Not only the art is fun, but the story is fun as well. Where I think I'm really missing out is not having read George's Mother by Stephen Crane, because I suspect that this story is based largely on the events that take place in George's Mother. And again, I can't tell. I'm at a loss, and I can't tell you if this is a fact because I haven't read that novel. I've read a lot of Stephen Crane. I used to teach Stephen Crane all the time. I know The Red Badge of Courage. I know Maggie, a Girl of the Street. I know a variety of his short stories. Blue Hotel, Bride Comes to Yellow Sky, and of course, The Open Boat. I mean, these are the things that he's most famous for, Stephen Crane. But George's Mother is notoriously underread and underrepresented in the scholarship. And I'm not a Stephen Crane scholar, but I know enough to where I know that a lot of people really don't do much with that novel. So I do think that that's one of the reasons why I'm just not familiar with it. But had I read it, I'm sure that I could go through Lawrence's Drippy's Mama and see, okay, this is a parallel to the rough storyline of George's mother. And the reason I suspect this is because this story definitely does have a turn-of-the-century feel. Late 19th century, not even turn of the century. A lot of the things that go on, and especially when it comes to the interactions. I mean, there's a lot of camaraderie among male figures, and you find this in, Drippy meeting Harry and all the other guys that he hangs out with. I think there's only one female that's a part of this gang. What's her name? Hippie girl, hippie lady?
Oh, you mean Drippette?
No, not Drippette. I mean, she's not a part of the gang that hang out and drink together.
No, she just kind of comes in and out a couple of times.
Right, she's the love interest. And,
right.
There's something about Drippette and the way that Drippy is drawn to her that also strikes me as very Stephen Crane-esque. Mm-hmm. So you're right, Drippy is at a crossroads. How much time should he spend with his mother? How much time should he spend with his friends? He's trying to find his own way in life. He, regrets the fact that he has this dead-end job as selling newspapers, and he's stuck living with his mother. He wants to get out and do things. He doesn't want to be treated like a child anymore. But at the same time, he feels guilty, especially at the end. Again, I'm not going to give anything away with what happens, in that he's not really treating his mother the way that he should. So, I wish I had the time before the show to actually go through and read George's mother, but I did not. But it just struck me as this probably closely parallels that. And this next book, the next Drippy book that's going to be coming out later, is going to be based around the Red Badge of Courage.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so I'm sure I can determine whether that is, roughly aligned with Stephen Crane's original narrative.
Yeah. Well, and again, I had not read the Stephen Crane novel, and it sounds like I'm not alone, which is good to hear, but I would like to read it. But having that Carter family song introduction, I kind of had an idea of what might happen or the way things might progress, and they pretty much did. And Derek, you're absolutely right about this story could take place pretty much any time. There's practically no technology in the entire story, except we do get a couple of scenes of a record player and a microphone on a stage. But other than that, everything looks really, really primitive. We're talking like 19th century, we see like horse and buggy, that type of thing. So it very much conjures up a certain time. And to me, Derek, this kind of conjured up the feel of something that might have been like an underground comic back in the day. It's very cartoonish.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, but it's also very stylized and very detailed too. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of those comics were.
Yeah, and one of the things that Andy Brown pointed out when I talked with him earlier was the fact that, Drippy actually is a character that Julian Lawrence has written for his local papers. And so a lot of his readers are going to recognize Drippy as a character here. And I think the cartoony, almost over-the-top tone really is one of the most affecting parts of this book. Now, you mentioned earlier that when we first see Drippy, he's walking through Drippy Town, and we see the large candy canes and lollipops or whatnot. And I think that the exaggeration in this book, that's just one example of it. But, I love it. And we see this with a vengeance. I don't know, not quite half of the way in, when Drippy tells his mother that he's going to the Forbidden Zone. Mm-hmm. Remember, because that's where one of the characters, Bleecker, lives.
Yeah, Bleeker's house.
Yeah. And when he tells his mother, instead of going to church with her one evening, as of course she wants him to, he says, "No, I'm going to the Forbidden Zone." And his mother is really shaken by that and says, "Oh no!" And then we see him running out of the house. Mm-hmm. And again, we don't have page numbers on this, so I can't tell you where the pages are. But he's running toward this city, and there's a big sign that says the Forbidden Zone and an arrow. And you can see that it looks like flames are coming out of this city. And then we have this big panel in the very center of the page, and we're introduced to the Forbidden Zone, and it's about everything bad you can imagine.
Right.
In one corner, there's a pile of skull and bones. There are people fighting. There's a guy trying to put out a fire, but he really doesn't care because he's lighting a cigarette. Inside of an apartment building, someone is watching television, and in the next to him, someone's just hung himself. And then on top of that apartment building is a guy with 2 guns. He's just firing off. There's a dog in the street with a skull in its mouth. There's a shot up and broken up car, windows bashed and all. There's debauchery, a guy drinking liquor, and a girl with a tube top sitting near him. And then there's another girl right next to him stabbing a guy in the back. Yeah, a fire in a building, a guy getting ready to jump off, a zombie. A man with a passenger that looks like woman with a cat's head, and in the back seat is someone who's being kidnapped, it looks like. Someone either dead or drunk in the street. Anyway, bottom line, anything that is bad, a woman holding a baby with blood marks on it, okay, anything that could be bad in Forbidden Town, we see here in this panel.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's great.
It's quite a panel. And I, like you said, I'm reading from a PDF, so I'm not sure exactly how big this comic is. Is it kind of a standard size, Derek, or is it more of a mini comic size?
No, this is European album size.
Oh,
so
okay,
it's
so it's pretty big.
It's larger. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's so many. Just the drinking scenes alone are hilarious and worth the price of the book. There's just so many great weird characters, and I mean if you enjoy seeing a lot of weird characters getting drunk and drunker and drunker, there's a lot here to laugh at.
Mm-hmm. Oh, exactly. And this also strikes me as very Crane-esque. Mm-hmm. Again, not having read George's Mother, but I have read Maggie, A Girl of the Street. And Maggie, the character of that book, which is actually Stephen Crane's first novel, does make an appearance in George's Mother. And one of the things you find in Maggie is the ill effects of drinking. So, I mean, I have no clue if Crane was a teetotaler. I guess he wasn't. I haven't read his biography. But, we do see a side of life, especially in the city, that could be a detriment to the dwellers there. And that is, the accessibility of bars and whatnot, where even a kid could walk into a bar with a bucket and buy beer for the family. I mean, that's the kind of things that you find in Maggie, and so I'm sure that those things are also in George's Mother. So when these guys get together and drink, this just strikes me as the kind of thing that Crane wrote about, especially when it comes to things that go on in the city.
Yeah.
And it's worth pointing out that Crane got his start as a reporter. And so he worked the city beat and knew a lot of the things that went on. So that's one of the reasons why Stephen. I'm sorry, this is the professor in me, American Lit professor in me coming out. This is one of the reasons why Stephen Crane is usually described as one of America's early naturalists, because he wrote about a reality, not only the way it actually was, but that there's also almost kind of like a fatalness to it, a determined way that the world worked. And usually there is a very dark side to reality and human interaction, as you see in a lot of naturalist writers. And I think that with Stephen Crane, with Jack London, you saw the natural world, a kind of naturalism in the natural world, right? Call of the Wild is a good example of that, the short story To Build a Fire. But with Stephen Crane, the naturalism and this kind of determined world that we live in, where we think we have choice but we really don't, takes place in urban dwellings.
And I think you see some of that even in Drippy's relationship to his mother. I mean, there's clearly, he has choices that he has to make, and he has decisions that he has to make, and clearly there's something that he wants to do, and then there are the obligations that he feels obliged to or not to do. So we do see, even though I haven't read much Crane, you see some of those elements of that creeping into this comic.
Exactly. And if we did want to read Drippy's Mama as a naturalist comic, we can see that in naturalist narrative, it's not as if characters have a choice. So if characters they think they do, but if characters have no choice, then what kind of moral judgment should we bring to their actions, right? I mean, if we're at the mercy of forces outside of our control from the outside as well as from the inside, our urges, our desires, our lusts and whatnot, then what does that tell us about the way that humans interact or about humankind at all? So we see a naturalist course of events taking place at the very beginning when Drippy runs into Harry. And when he makes this choice to go to the bar with him and then later to join him that evening with Harry's drinking buddies, he wants to fit in. Is this desire to be a part of a pack, so to speak, if you want to talk about the naturalist world. And so he has to balance that with his feelings for his mother and his sense of being a good son, right? He's stuck between these hard places that are not going to be compatible at all.
Right. And to compound things, he's the only surviving son. He's the only one left.
Right. His father's dead and his siblings are dead, so Drippy is actually all that Mama has.
Right.
So I loved this book, and I can't wait to the second Drippy the Newsboy volume.
Yeah, I liked it a lot as well. I would be interested, especially having heard you say that the next one's going to be based on the Red Badge of Courage. That should be interesting.
Yeah. Well, you want to get to the last book we're going to be discussing this week.
That's right. We have one more book.
And this, I think, and I got the sense of this from talking with Andy Brown, is kind of the jewel in the crown of the spring releases for Conundrum Press. Not to short shrift any of the others, because I think they're all incredible. But this one is a hardback, and it's a very nice volume. It is by Dakota McFadzean. Don't Get Eaten by Anything, a collection of the Dailies, 2011 through 2013. Now, Andy, if you recall, last year I had the pleasure of having Dakota on the show for an interview. Mm-hmm. And it was just the two of us talking, and we had a great conversation. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with him was because issue number 5 of Irene, the anthology Irene, had just come out, and he is one of the creators and editors of Irene. And so I started to correspond with Dakota. Actually, after reading his collection that came out about a year and a half ago called Other Stories and the Horse You Rode In On, which is a collection of short fiction. And so I got in touch with him, asked if he wanted to do an interview around the time of the release of Irene number 5. And I got to know him back and forth through email. He sent me not only an issue of Irene, but also an issue of a short comic he did called Hollow in the Hollows, which is just outstanding. I love Dakota's work. And one of the things, though, that is worth noting is not only does he have these aforementioned books, but he also does a daily webcomic called The Dailies, and it comes out every day, thus the title, The Dailies. And he started this before 2011, but as Dakota mentions at the very beginning of Don't Get Eaten by Anything, in an introduction, that's in comics form. Okay, so this is not a prose introduction. This is an introduction in panel form. And he says that, he began the dailies as an exercise. He says it's a process more than a product. And the earliest installments, which you can see online if you go to his website, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes, but they were very personally based. They dealt with him and his life. And he says he got the idea to do the dailies after reading Kalchanka's American Elf strips. So he wanted to do something similar, but he felt after a while that writing only about himself wasn't very interesting and wasn't going to take him very far. And so he starts this volume on January 1st, 2011. So by this point, he's been doing the dailies for a little while. And you can see that at least in the first several months, we do get a good number of these daily strips that are about him and his life. So, for instance, he's going to the college, what is it, CCA, is it College for Cartoon Art, in Vermont. And he talks about his student days there, the various assignments that he has to do, his encounters with his, I don't know if it was his wife at this time, maybe a significant other, I'm not sure. And so we do get some of these strips are devoted to his day-to-day living, his art, his school, whether or not he should shave. You know, there are a couple of strips that deal with that. But as we get more and more into the dailies, we see that his personal life almost all but fades from the topic of the stories, the daily strips. And as for the other non-autobiographical strips, how would you describe them?
Well, we should tell listeners that some of these are recurring strips. Like he has a series that, as you mentioned, that appear to be autobiographical, but most of these are early. But there are other things that come back from time to time, such as Elephant Comics, God Comics, Cowboy and his horse Petunia. There's a little ghost going boo. There's birds that are flying and talking at the same time. So you have some of these things that recur, and some of these themes and characters that recur, and then some of them are just one shots. He has a character come on, something happens, you never see him again. So in that way, it's kind of like a true newspaper strip anthology type of series.
And also there are some, and you're right about the recurring scenarios and characters like the ghost or the birds or the cowboy with his horse Petunia. I mean, those recur every now and again, but there are also every now and again a series of strips, and more times than not, these are a week long, like from a Sunday to a Saturday, where you will have an ongoing storyline. Now, most of the comics and the dailies, going from one day to the next, the stories aren't connected. But when they are, many times it's a week-long series of strips that tell, I guess you could say, a story. Sometimes it doesn't seem like much of a story, but they're all interconnected. Usually there is some kind of narrative cohesion among those week-long strips. Sometimes they are thematically or image-based, where you can see that he's writing from similar premises or ideas from one day to the next. But I think most of these strips can easily stand on their own. They're just one-shots. Like, for instance, a guy. I mean, I just opened up to page 370 or 273, but you could open to any page really and see examples of this. We see a guy. We see him from the back, and he's in front of this store window, and he's looking at what looks like faces. And then he turns around and he walks away, and we see that he has a hole in his face. And he has little grumble marks coming from his mouth in the word bubble. And then he looks up and sees an owl. And then in the last panel, the owl has taken roost in his face, in the hole inside his face. And that's it.
Yeah.
Okay? And so we have a lot of strips like that. Now, there are... I don't want to say that all of the strips have this kind of absurdist feel to them, because there's some that don't. But there are many that do, and that there's some strips in this Dailies collection that is so out there, that is so whacked out. I have no sense of what the hell Dakota has going on in his head. Yeah. And I love that. I mean, I love his sense of humor.
Yeah, I do too. And you get the feel too that he's doing a lot of experimentation, which is great. And this is probably the best format to do that, because you're doing a daily strip, and sometimes you just start writing something, or you just start drawing something, and we might not get it. He might not get it. He may not even know himself what he's doing, but it's still funny. There's a lot of that going on, and you're right, Derek. There's a lot of repetition going on. We see a lot of characters, like you mentioned, with the face cut out, and then the rest of the face is either like laying on the sidewalk, or a bird has it in their mouth, or something like that. We see a lot of kids or a lot of young people turning into extremely old people, monsters emerging from human heads, that type of thing. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Derek, and I feel like Dakota is probably a pretty young guy. I would think he's probably in his 30s,
he is.
Maybe. There seems to be, and I don't mean for this to sound like an obsession, but there are a lot of strips that deal with getting old.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, everybody's got to deal with that at some point. But he does it in a way that's funny, and a lot of times it's hilariously funny. But it also makes you stop and think. Like good strips do that, and good comedy does that too. So he has a really, like you said, kind of a whacked out sense of humor sometimes, but a lot of it really is right on target. And I really like his sense of humor.
Oh, exactly. I do as well. And also, like the good comics artist that he is, he does have an understanding of the history of comics, and every now and again that history will come out in his strips. For instance, and this is on page 264, the strip that came out on Friday, March 1st, 2013, it's funny. It starts off with, there's a duck going whack, 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 and someone behind him is putting a jacket on. And then in the next panel, he's going whack, 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 whack. Someone's putting a top hat on him. So he's looking like Uncle Scrooge. Yeah. And then they push him out the door. And, of course, this duck is going whack, 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 whack. And in the very last panel, there are two people that look like scientists, right, because they have the clipboard and the white jackets. And one says to the other, "Now we wait." Yeah. And the other says, "But have we gone too far?" I love that stuff.
Yeah,
and there are many references to The Simpsons. Mm-hmm. There are many references to Garfield. I think there's one, and I can't remember where it is right now, where a guy's cat mentions something about lasagna, and the guy reaches into the cat's mouth and then pulls out this really weirdly crumpled up Garfield-looking thing.
Yeah. We know it's supposed to be Garfield.
Yeah. And so, this really offbeat and at times sick sense of humor. Mm-hmm. And when I say sick, it morbid as well. There's a lot of death, mm-hmm. but death with humor. Mm-hmm. There's just a sense of darkness. I mean, this, in some ways, I think you could define it as black humor. And by the way, I used to tell my students, black humor doesn't mean humor by African Americans. I mean, there is a different kind of humor called black humor that has nothing to do with race. But and that's the kind of strange, absurdist scenarios that we have going on here.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you mentioned that about there are a lot of comics dealing with death, and I think one of the ways that we deal with death is we laugh at it, and he certainly does a good job of making us do that. A couple of my favorite ones are there's a strip, it's toward the end of the book, where there's a funeral, and there's someone standing up in front of the casket saying, "Well, Sam worked a job, watched TV, and always complained about weather and strangers. We'll remember Sam until we don't, and then no one will. Anyone else?" I mean, that pretty much says it all, and that's you think about it and you get to the end of your life, and that's, people will remember that person until we don't, and then no one will. But it's just having it in a comic form like that's just so funny, because we're faced with the reality of it, and you either have to laugh or, cry. And then there's a couple of other ones that, there's one I really like of an artist, and I assume it's a cartoonist, and he's drawing, and he says, "If I could just do this or do that, then I'd be happy." And there's a couple more panels like that, and it ends with an old man saying, "If I could just make stuff as freely as when I was a kid, then I'd be happy again."
Yeah, and there are these very profound strips with those kind of messages that tell us something about death and growing old. And you're right, there seems to be, that's one of the themes. I don't want to say obsession, but it's one of the themes that you'll find in Dakota's strips, at least. Yeah. But I think even in his shorter comics as well, which I want to mention in a second, something about older people or getting old and what that might mean. So there are a lot of really keen insights that we can bring here, but sometimes the premises of some of the stories are just so strange that it's hilarious. Now, one of my favorites is from the early days of the Dailies, and this is dated Sunday, January 23rd, 2011. And we see in the first panel a clown. Okay, so you know I'm going to enjoy this, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a clown, and then this kid walks up to the clown and then looks a little uncertain and then looks askance at the clown. And then by the time we get to the fourth panel, the kid says, "Are you a scary clown?" And, of course, still smiling, the clown says, "Oh, yes."
Yeah.
Little things like that. And that's right next to another strip dated January 26, 2011, Time-Traveling Rabbit. So there's this rabbit in what looks like a modern cityscape, and then there's this weird white ball that's vibrating in front of him. And then the next panel, there's the swirly vertigo lines, and something's happened to the rabbit. And then the rabbit looks up, and a castle is in the background, and he goes back to eating grass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, again, not much goes on. It's really offbeat. And sometimes it's difficult to figure out exactly what the hell is going on in this particular strip. But that's the reason why I love it. And you know, I said a moment ago that I wanted to mention some of his shorter fiction. I would highly recommend for anyone who has not read it to pick up Dakota McFadzean's book that came out a couple of years ago. Let me see. Yeah, it was 2013. Other Stories and the Horse You Rode In On. And in fact, the title story, and the horse you rode in on, has the cowboy and his horse Petunia in it, which we see often in the Dailies collection. Yep. And this is a series of shorter stories. There are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 if we count the epilogue stories in this collection. And some of the characters that you see in the daily strips you also find in Other Stories and the Horse You Rode In On. Now, I already mentioned the cowboy and Petunia, but there's also Ghost Rabbit, and in the story Leave Luck to Heaven, which it was collected in not last year's, but I think the year before's Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's Best American Comics collection. We see these two young guys playing video games. And the one who has this kind of cheesy mustache with the shaggy hair is very philosophical, and he is like the teacher to the other guy who has glasses, who comes to learn more about video games. And again, this is in Other Stories and the Horse You Rode In On, but also collected a couple of years ago in Great American Comics. But I mention this because these same two characters also appear in a variety of strips in Don't Get Eaten by Anything. So there are certain characters, certain scenarios, and certain situations and themes that define Dakota McFadzean's style, I would say. And you can find them not only in Don't Get Eaten by Anything, but also in the short story collection. The difference between the short story collection and Don't Get Eaten by Anything is, I think, the way you approach and maybe consume the book. I don't know about you, but when it comes to Don't Get Eaten by Anything, I feel that that's the kind of book that you can pick up occasionally. I mean, you can easily sit down and read it from cover to cover in 1, 2, or multiple sittings, okay? I mean, I don't want to suggest that it's so simple and bare that you can, do it in one sitting. If it's a marathon sitting, yeah, maybe. But it's something that because it's the nature of it, it's strips, it's daily strips. And for the most part, as we mentioned, not one strip has much, if anything, to do with the others that come after it. So you can pick it up and put it aside. Maybe read it at bedtime, or maybe carry it to work with you, and over your breaks you can read a few of the strips and then pick it up again and not really have lost anything. And that's not the way that you would read either a more longer form comic or even the short stories in his Other Stories and the Horse You Rode In On collection. So it's a different manner of reading, and I think one of the things that makes Don't Get Eaten by Anything really stand out among the 5 spring releases from Conundrum is its strip nature.
Right. Yeah, and all of these, I think in every single one of them is a 4-panel strip. So they're all pretty much uniform. The great thing about this book, Derek, like you alluded to also, is this is the type of book that you can take to work with you or eat on your lunch break, and you can just show it to the person sitting next to you and just say, hey, read a couple of these. Let me know what you think. You can read as many of them at one time as you want to, or as few as you want to if you just want to read a couple at a time. It's not a book you want to just rush through. It's a book to have fun with.
Yeah, it's, we were talking earlier about both Moose and the Disappearance of Charley Butters. The pacing is a little slower and more methodical, and it asks you to slow down and take in everything. Now, Don't Get Eaten by Anything asks you to read slowly, but in a completely different way.
Right.
These are stories that, you'll read a strip, and I think with most of them, you should stop and just think, what did I just read? What is he trying to say? Is he trying to say anything? And then I think that very process of trying to figure out what Dakota has written, I think it's funny, the very process of trying to make sense of something that maybe inherently is not supposed to make sense.
Right. And I think a lot of them aren't supposed to make sense, and I think we just reflect on them and think, what's he doing here? And that's part of the fun of it, and not getting some of them is just part of the entertainment value.
Well, Andy, some of these books were introduced at TCAF a couple of weeks ago, and I'm glad that we have had the opportunity to discuss all 5. We started off with Zach Worton's The Disappearance of Charley Butters, then went to Max de Radiguès's, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that name, his book Moose. Then we moved on to Kat Verhoeven's Towerkind, then the Stephen Crane-inspired work from Julian Lawrence, Drippy, The Adventures of Drippy the Newsboy, Book 1, Drippy's Mama, and then finally this big tome from Dakota McFadzean, Don't Get Eaten by Anything, a collection of the Dailies 2011 through 2013. So a lot of good reading.
Yeah, and I hope listeners will find one of these or more that they're interested in and pick it up and give Conundrum Press a try.
As I mentioned in my brief conversation with Andy Brown, a couple of years ago, I really wasn't aware of Conundrum Press. I had read one or two of their books, but I didn't really see it as a publisher that I should be paying more attention to. Let's say, like I'm very much aware of Drawn in Quarterly or Fantagraphics, right? But when it comes to alternative comics, I think Fantagraphics and Drawn in Quarterly, those are the big kids on the block.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of presses like Conundrum that do incredible stuff when it comes to alternative comics. And we've talked about some of those in the past. But I think that for me, Conundrum over the past year or two is one of my favorite finds, if I put that in quotation marks, because it's been around a long time. But it was me discovering them. And I think that Andy Brown is doing one hell of a great job in bringing a lot of these cartoon artists to print. Great books.
Yeah, and if this is any indication, I'm certainly looking forward to what will be coming out in the fall and beyond.
Yep. And, as we talk about on our preview shows in the back half of the catalog, you can find a lot of these Conundrum Press books solicited, and you can pre-order them by going to the website of our big sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. They'll set you up with something good. It's a great place to get your funny books, Conundrum Press included. And then after you do pre-order your books there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. Go to our website, comicsalternative.com, click on Contact Us, and you will see a big red button that says Start Recording. Press it, and from the comfort of your own computer or mobile device, you can leave us a recording through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's just that simple. So more people should be doing it. But you can also call us the old-fashioned way. Our number's 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And we hope that you will join us on Twitter, where you can find news and updates to the blog and the podcast. At Twitter, we are the number 2 guys. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs, and we appreciate all those who favor our tweets and retweet our tweets. And you can also get in touch with us through email. You can email us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can reach me at Wolverton@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, how about you?
You can reach me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com. We're also on Facebook, on Tumblr, and on Instagram. We also have our new YouTube channel, so go there and check us out on YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, and you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary that we put up on the blog at our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. There's all kinds of ways to get in touch with us. And Derek, we should probably also mention, too, that we all three, you, me, and Andy Kunkel, will be together at Heroes Con. And that's going to be in June.
Almost exactly a month away.
Almost exactly, yeah. The 19th, 20th, and 21st.
Yeah, so if you're in that area and you plan on attending Heroes Con, make sure you come by Podcaster's Alley. I think that's what they call it. And we will have a table there. In fact, Andy, I'm in the process of trying to design an image to have printed on a table covering for us.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so hey, we're going big time.
All right.
So let us see you there if you're at the con. But we will definitely be back next week to discuss more great new comics. And until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.
Komm hier zum Herd!